Today we're finishing up a series called Faith to Look Foolish, and we've been journeying through the subject of faith in the Gospel of Matthew. So if you have a Bible, why don't you open it with me now and turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15. You can kind of just put a placeholder there because we'll get to that in just a little bit. The title of the message today is Faith Through Fire. Faith through fire. I have a question for you. Do you think it's possible for God to be amazed? Like the omnipotent, almighty, all-seeing, all-knowing, first and last, Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. Do you think it's possible for that kind of God to ever be genuinely amazed? In the Gospel of Luke, there's a couple of stories that tell us that Jesus was, in two particular moments, he was amazed. He marveled. And both of those stories have to do with the subject of faith. The first occasion, Jesus marvels, he's amazed because of a total lack of faith. The second story, Jesus marvels, he's amazed because of such great faith that he sees. That's an amazing thing to me, that the God of the universe would ever be amazed by anything. But then, specifically, that he would be amazed by the faith, or the lack thereof, of a person. I bring that up because today we're looking at a story in the Gospel of Matthew that is about great faith. And therefore, we are looking at a story that fits into the category of what Jesus considers amazing. And so it's awesome. It's a powerful story. We've been leading up to the story for the last 4 weeks. You guys remember the journey of the faith chiasm that we've been going on? 30% of you? Okay, that's great. Put up the picture. Maybe that will jog their memory. This is our faith chiasm right here. Yeah, come on. We're turning you on to little theologians. Oh, wow. It's such great art. So this is our faith chiasm, and what we learned is that in the Gospel of Matthew, right in the middle, there are 5 stories on faith that are arranged in exactly this way. A chiasm is something that follows this kind of pattern, like an A, B, C, B, A kind of pattern. So we have no faith, little faith, great faith, little faith, no faith. And what we've been learning on the journey is that each of these stages, if you will, of faith have different obstacles. They have different enemies. And so we learned that to have no faith is to face off with the obstacle of familiarity. Familiarity for the disciple is when your previous experience with Jesus dictates your potential experience with Jesus. Where what you've been through before determines the kind of belief that you have in a particular moment for what can happen in the present moment. It's when the past dictates to you what's possible in the now. That's familiarity in the life of a disciple. I've prayed this prayer before. It's not going to work. I've been in this kind of circumstance. I've seen this kind of situation before. Nothing's going to happen. Jesus isn't going to move. And so you come to the point where you think that you know him, and so you stop short of really knowing him. If your knowledge of Jesus does not lead you to trust in Jesus, then you don't know him. Because true knowledge of Jesus Christ leads to trust in Jesus Christ. And that's not a rebuke, that's an invitation. Keep pressing in to know him all the more. That's why we worship the way that we do, because we have not come just to sing about Jesus. We've come to encounter Jesus, to get to know him, to adore him, to be in his presence, so that our own mindsets and mentalities would be shifted about how we see things in front of us. The answer to familiarity is honor. So we come with high praise. That's what Jesus says in the first story of no faith to the Nazarenes. He says, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, except around the people who are most familiar with him. So familiarity is akin to dishonor, and therefore the solution to familiarity is for you to up your honor towards Jesus. And the Bible makes it clear that wherever we bring honor, we cultivate life. Honor in our finances, just like Wes was talking about a moment ago, particularly in your relationship with Jesus. I cannot impress it upon you enough. Honor him with the first of your day. Some of us were disappointed in who we think Jesus is, but you give him 5 minutes every morning. He remains unnecessarily a mystery to you because you don't honor him the first of your day and set aside your time to seek him. It's not too much for Jesus to ask. Most of the people in the scriptures who are described as being really close to God were people that gave him the morning. David was a man after God's own heart. He said, "Early will I seek you." Jesus, of course, is as close to the Father as you can get. The Gospel of Mark says he would get up early in the morning before the sun rose to pray. You want to be the kind of Christian? This is the kind of Christian I want to be. I want to be the kind of Christian where other people look at me, even other Christians, and go, I want to know Jesus the way that guy knows Jesus. And I'm not there yet. But I know that if I keep honoring him and giving him the first of all my being, all my worth, everything that I have, that I'm going to grow in my relationship with the Lord Jesus. And you can do the same, and we can live the most wonderful life together if we make it our mission to know him and overcome familiarity. The next stage is the stage of little faith. Little faith in the Gospel of Matthew is always associated with fear and worry. And it's always fear over like basic things. It's never fear over like something really big and scary. It's fear over like basic things like protection. If I follow Jesus, will I be safe? Or provision. If I follow Jesus, will I have enough? And it always involves the 12. In other words, those who were closest to Jesus were still struggling with fear. Why? Because they took their eyes off of seeking first the kingdom and they put their eyes back on themselves. And the answer to fear, the Bible says, is perfect love. Perfect love casts out fear. In Galatians 2, verse 20, the Apostle Paul makes this amazing statement. He says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live. But Christ lives in me. The life that I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul's life of faith is such that he doesn't even count himself alive to himself anymore. He's just alive to Christ. It's Christ living in him. And that life of faith, it stems from a revelation that Paul has that Jesus loved him. The past tense is so important. Paul is particularly thinking of the cross. He loved me and gave himself for me. You want to see perfect love? Look at the Lamb of God slain on the cross, loving you in that moment. And your fear will bow before the perfect love of Jesus Christ. And now we come to the pinnacle of our chiasm, to the story of great faith. In Matthew 15, beginning in verse 21, it says, leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman. Now, the Canaanites were Israel's most ancient enemy. So, we're getting set up for some suspense here in this story. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly, and Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him, and they urged Jesus. They said, send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. She's annoying. And Jesus answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And the woman came and knelt before Jesus and said, Lord, help me. And Jesus replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now let's just pause here for a moment and just consider all of the possible responses from this woman at this moment. Jesus, that's not nice. Jesus, forget you. Jesus, how dare you? But she doesn't say anything like that. She goes, actually, Jesus, it is right to toss the children's food to the dogs. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Then Jesus said to her, woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted, and her daughter was healed at that moment. Now, this story of the Canaanite woman is a high point in Matthew's gospel for two different reasons. It's actually a high point, not just in the chiasm of faith, it's a high point overall in the entire narrative of Matthew's gospel. We're just about in the center of Matthew, and the story of this Gentile woman connects both to the beginning of Matthew's gospel and to the end. If you're a Bible reader here today, maybe you remember that Matthew begins his gospel with something called a genealogy. It's the lineage of Jesus, the family line of Jesus. And unusually in the genealogy of Jesus, Matthew mentions 4 women. In fact, not just 4 women, but 4 Gentile women who are in the family line of Jesus Christ. And so this is a woman who's pointing back to what Matthew was hinting at in the beginning, that Jesus came to redeem and save Gentiles. And then she also connects to the very end of Matthew, where we have the Great Commission, where Jesus says, I want you to go and make disciples, not just in Jerusalem and Judea, not just in Samaria, but to the ends of the earth. In other words, in Gentile territory. So we have this woman who's a high point of what begins in Matthew's gospel and what concludes with the Great Commission, but she's also a high point of that faith chiasm, going from no faith to little faith to now great faith. She is the center of the Tootsie Pop. that we've been journeying to, I'll just leave that metaphor there, that we've been journeying towards. Which is kind of unusual to me, that she's such a high point and a picture of great faith, because the story is a little bit anticlimactic. I mean, faith stories in Matthew so far, they've involved dramatic healings, a paralytic walking, blind people seeing, Peter walking on water, driving out demons. And all of that activity, by the way, just gets associated with ordinary faith. Like just faith. And yet here is this woman, and she is the picture, the example of a faith called great. Why? Because she didn't back down when Jesus said something offensive to her? I mean, compared to walking on water, compared to a woman who'd been sick for 12 years, who literally crawled along the ground through the feet of a crowd where she wasn't supposed to be, saying to herself, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed. And that's just ordinary faith, but this woman has great faith. What's that all about? Well, I think the tension in that is exactly the point. Because faith is not always all about dramatic, miraculous moments, though this woman does receive a miracle. Faith, many times, is about perseverance through difficulty when we don't initially get what we're believing God for. Faith is persevering instead of giving up and getting offended when God doesn't respond to our circumstances and requests the way that we want him to. And let's not dance around it. Offense is a big part of this story. I mean, it's a shocking story. Jesus calls the woman a dog. Now, some people try to explain that away. Like, don't look here. Let's pretend this is not in the Bible. But you can't get around it. If Matthew didn't want you to be confronted with this story, he wouldn't have put it in his gospel. He would have left it out so you could just go on believing that Jesus would never say anything to you that you perceive as mean. But Matthew doesn't do that. He shows us that Jesus offends this woman. Now, it's not malicious. And it's not unnecessarily mean-spirited. But if heaven had an HR department, Jesus is getting fired. Like, this isn't passing the DEI thing. You deal with it. And yet the woman does not take offense. She persists in asking for her miracle. And as a result, Jesus says, woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. What's Matthew trying to show us? He's trying to show us that great faith is faith that overcomes offense, particularly offense that comes from God not doing what we want when we want. And Jesus is allowed to offend you because he's God. And if he does, then he has a reason. John Wimber, the founder of the Vineyard movement, said that Jesus will offend your mind to expose your heart. He wants to expose what is in the core of your being in terms of how much you fully, truly trust him and want to walk with him. I mean, just consider the gospel as the ultimate example. Just like Jesus' words to the Canaanite woman, the gospel wounds before it heals. Right? You are a sinner worthy of death. It's not nice. It's kind of offensive. I don't know where we got this idea that Jesus' job is just to go around being nice all the time, but it's not biblical. How can a man who's called the truth be perpetually nice? Because sometimes the truth not all that nice. Because he comes to wound in order to heal. And if that's true at the start of your journey, then wouldn't that also be true throughout the duration of your journey as you walk with Jesus? That he wants to offend your mind, to draw something out of you that will take you to the next place, the next stage in your discipleship to him. Here's two ways that Jesus might offend you. Number one, he might offend you with his timing. He might offend you by not doing things on your watch. If Jesus makes you wait for your breakthrough, will you get offended and give up, or will you persist and have great faith? Think of Mary and Martha, who sent a message to Jesus through a messenger, and the message was, Jesus, the one whom you love, their brother Lazarus, is sick. And John chapter 11 says that Jesus intentionally waited 2 more days in the place where he was, so that by the time he got to Bethany, where Mary and Martha were, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. They call for Jesus to come. Jesus, we need a miracle. Jesus doesn't come when they want him to come. And because he waited, Lazarus died. But then it says this amazing thing in John 11, verses 21 and 22. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. That's a wild statement. Because now, Lazarus is dead. Now, the situation is the definition of hopeless. Now, all the chickens have hatched. The last whistle is blown. The heavy-set yet still body-positive woman has sung. I don't want HR to call, That's where things are at for Mary and Martha now. But regardless of what now is, Jesus wants you to know that you can have an even now kind of faith. A great faith that says, but I still know that even though the situation has gone from bad to worse, from sick to dead, now it's 4 days in the tomb, I still know that you are able to do great and mighty things and good things, even if it's not the original thing that I wanted. That's the persistence of great faith. It's like when Job literally lost everything, and he said, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. That kind of trust is not resignation to whatever happens. That kind of trust is persistence in prayer. That's what the story of the Canaanite woman shows us, that she persisted in her request. Just because it doesn't happen the first time doesn't mean that it's not the Lord's will for it to happen. Jesus said, ask and keep on asking, seek and keep on seeking, knock and keep on knocking. The very fact that that instruction is in the Bible tells us that the journey of faith is a journey of persistence. And that journey is not wasted time. That journey is the process of Christ-likeness being formed in us, which is the whole point of Christianity. A friend of mine, Landon, says it like this. He says, pray until you change God's mind, or until he changes yours. And many times God will change your mind because the thing that you've been asking for is not what God intends for you. And this also is a deepening of your trust, because you learn to trust that what God gives is even better than what you ask. Great faith perseveres when the opportunity for offense arises, because Jesus has made you walk through suffering. And sometimes you get to come out the other side with the breakthrough that you want, unless, of course, you don't. Because sometimes Jesus doesn't just offend you with his timing, Sometimes Jesus offends you with his answer. Maybe it's not simply that Jesus is making you wait. Maybe he's told you no. Maybe you don't get the miracle that you want. Would you still serve him anyway? In Luke chapter 2, there's this story of a lesser-known woman. Her name is Anna. And Anna is in the temple when Joseph and Mary, the parents of Jesus, bring Jesus as a baby into the temple to dedicate him to the Lord. And picking it up in verse 36, it says, there was a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel of the tribe of Asher, and she was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then she was a widow until she was 84, but she never left the temple but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. And that's an amazing story. 7 years into this woman's marriage, and then her husband dies. We're not told how her husband dies, but Anna, being the faithful kind of woman that she is, I'm sure she prayed, I'm sure she believed, I'm sure she hoped that God would heal and save her husband, and God didn't give her the answer that she wanted. Yet what does it say? She never left the temple. She worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. She carried on in great faith. Anna served God all her days in his house in spite of her disappointment. She could have gotten offended at God and used that as an excuse to stop serving him, but she didn't. She served him all the more. It's like the story of the 3 Hebrew boys in the book of Daniel when King Nebuchadnezzar was going to throw them into the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And such confidence they say to King Nebuchadnezzar, our God is able to deliver us from the furnace, but even if he doesn't, we will not serve your idols. In other words, the outcome of the situation does not change the fact that God is still God and your idols are still not. Great faith does not let an outcome judge the character of God. It does not let what happens determine our vision, our understanding of who God is. Maybe for some of you, God hasn't answered your prayer that you've been praying to him. Maybe he hasn't given you a yes, and you're not sure if he will or not. Will you serve him anyway? What does that look like? Well, serving God anyway often looks like serving people. Being the hands and feet of Jesus. You know what great faith is? Great faith is when you're willing to be an answer to somebody else's prayer, even when God hasn't answered your prayer. That's great faith. Persevering through the potential for offense because God didn't do what you wanted. And if you live that kind of way, you get to see a lot of great things. Think of Anna again, hanging out in the temple. She gets to see Jesus. She sees Messiah, the hope of humanity. It says that she was worshiping and praying night and day, fasting and in prayer all the time. Do you know what Anna was praying for? She was praying for the redemption of her people. And here he comes. You see, Anna didn't get to see the answer that she wanted 84 years prior. But she got to see an even better answer to the prayer that she'd been praying for 84 years. In fact, the implication is that the reason she's so devoted in the temple is because of the suffering that she walked through. I wonder what kind of things you will see come from the hand of God if you allow your suffering to push you into great faith and perseverance and continued trust rather than offense and bailing on God's wonderful plan for your life. You see, that's really what these 2 points are about today. It's about the power and importance of suffering in your journey with Jesus and the role that they play in forming great faith for you and I. difficulty holds up a mirror to your faith. It refines your faith. Peter says that gold is refined by fire. How much more should we expect our faith, which is way more precious than gold, to also be refined by fire? Well, of course we should expect that. It's the most precious possession that you have, your faith in Christ. It should be refined by fire. Maybe God's suffering that he's allowing you to walk through is his mercy towards you, because it's revealing to you the foundation that your life is built upon. As long as you go without deep suffering, the only faith you'll know is surface level faith. You'll know faith that is determined by circumstance. You'll know momentary faith, but it's the deepest of suffering that reveals the truth of our foundation. Shows us what our life is really built upon. Is your faith built upon the perfect circumstances? Is your faith built upon the preferred outcome? Is your faith built upon the idealistic picture of the way that you think things ought to be? As long as your faith is planted upon the foundation of a certain outcome, you will never get beyond that stage of little faith, because you'll always revert back to fear. Because as long as your object of faith is what you want to happen, then you will get scared when what you're wanting does not look like it's going to happen. So you'll take your eyes off of Jesus and his glory, and you'll put your eyes back on yourself and your preferences, and you'll be stunted by fear instead of persevering in faith towards the great plan that God has for and through your life. No wonder Jesus made Mary and Martha wait. I mean, he literally made them suffer. He could have come right when the messenger called, but he didn't. He makes them wait. Why? Because he knows that these women are going to need to be women of great faith, because in a short while, I'm going to the cross, tomb, resurrection, and back into heaven, and I'm going to need men and women of great faith in my church who know how to persevere when the fire dials up. And sometimes the fire does dial up. I don't know if you've been paying attention, but we don't live in the most friendly culture to the Christian faith anymore. You can anticipate some fire. And I want to have a church who know how to walk through fire and not turn around and give up, but keep persevering in great faith. In fact, in Acts chapter 7, there's a story of that kind of fire where persecution began to break out against the church in Jerusalem. There's a man named Stephen, an ordinary guy, wasn't an apostle. He basically ran the food bank for the church in Jerusalem. He handed out food to the widows. But he was also a man of great miracles, the book of Acts says. Could communicate the gospel powerfully. So powerfully, in fact, that one day his opponents surrounded him, intending on killing him, and he begins to preach the gospel, a prophetic word to them about why they keep rejecting God's Messiah. So they drag him outside of the city, and they pick up stones, and they get ready to stone Stephen to death. And this is an amazing moment to me, because Stephen has a vision of Jesus in heaven. Now, every other place in the New Testament where we see Jesus in heaven, do you know what his position is? He's seated at the right hand of the Father. That's what Jesus is doing in heaven right now. He is seated at the right hand of the Father. That is his position of authority that he has taken up the moment he ascended back into heaven, which is where he was when Stephen was about to lose his life for the sake of the gospel. But as Stephen looks at his opponents about to throw the first stone, it says in Acts chapter 7 and verse 56, look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Why? Because Stephen did not give up when he faced some fire, but rather he stood firm in his faith, and Jesus gave him a standing ovation for his perseverance, because he finds great faith amazing. And that's the kind of faith that you and I are invited to have. Not by necessarily working all of the greatest miracles, not by seeing all the coolest things happen, but by persevering when you walk through the potential for offense. Let's stand to our feet.